1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's how many things you need to build a computer. So let's do that. First up, I have the AMD 5600G. This is perfect because obviously there's no graphics cards around. So this is gonna be something that can actually play games pretty good and can tide you over for maybe the next year or possibly even 2 years, depending on what kind of graphic card you're looking to get and how much you're planning to spend in the future. It's gonna be socketed into the MSI Mag A520M Vector Wi-Fi. The reason I went with this board is because they're gonna be upgrading from a tablet, the Microsoft Surface, and obviously that has Wi-Fi capabilities. So I wanted to get a motherboard that had Wi-Fi built in and Bluetooth, so that way no matter where they go and whatever room they decide to put this computer in, they have connectability to anything and everything. This does support PCI Express 3.0, but it doesn't support 4.0, which is fine because the 5600G actually does not support PCI Express 4.0. So this motherboard is gonna be perfect pairing with it, and this can be upgraded with different CPUs in the future, but the 6-core 12-thread processor power of the 5600G is gonna be perfect for years to come. And again, PCI Express 4.0 for graphics cards, as of right now, are not really that much beneficial versus 3.0. And to link the two together, we actually went with faster RAM. This is the 3600 megahertz, the T-Force Dark ZA, which is AMD compatible. But not only that, I did check the specs for the motherboard, and it is compatible with this specific motherboard. So there should be no compatibility issues at all. This 16 gig kit is gonna be perfect for this motherboard and the processor. Reason being the integrated graphics on that CPU, because it's integrated, it needs caching memory. And because of that, it uses the system memory in that case. So if you have a faster set of RAM, you're actually gonna see more FPS in your video games. So that's why getting a faster set of RAM for an integrated CPU is a must. Next up, we are going with the storage. Yeah, it is a little bit faster. This is the SN750 SE. It will support the 3.0 specs, so it will be still super fast. But this way, as he upgrades into different systems going forward, he can easily swap this over and unlock the full potential of 4.0. The power supply that I went with is a little overkill for this system by a large margin. It is a semi-modular SeaSonic power supply, gold rated. I went with the 750 because I just had it extra laying around, and it's gonna be a nice addition to this PC for the future. So this is something that he could carry forward into other builds as the years go on. The alternative for the price budget of the 550 of what I recommend is the SeaSonic Core GM500. And that would be plenty enough for this system and should even be able to handle some graphics cards in the future. And all of these are gonna be going into the Rosewill SPECTRA D100A. Now this is a low budget computer case, and because of that, there are already some things that I see that have mistakes. Like I see some of these screws aren't actually straight into the glass, and the PCI Express slots aren't removable. They're removable, but only one time. I see some other things wrong with this, but we'll go over that as I take it apart. So with all that, let's get started. First thing up, let's get the CPU installed by lifting this latch here. And you can see right here, there's a little triangle there. And on the CPU, there's also a little triangle. Just make sure those are lined up. And it should just set right in there, no pressure. And then just hold it in place as you push it down, the lever, and it will lock right back into place there. And the CPU is installed. Typically, you would want to install a cooler, and with this, I just don't like the look of the AMD coming out sideways here. I would actually prefer it to be up top here. I know MSI is sideways as well, but to me, I just like having AMD up top. It just adds a little bit different look to it, and not everybody does that. So I'm gonna show you how to do that real quick. To get the shroud off, one thing you wanna check for first are there may be 2 holes underneath the AMD logo that may have screws in them. This is a newer version, so they don't have screws, but older versions may have this. So you would first want to remove 2 screws out of there. Next, what you want to do is start opposite of AMD to this bigger side. Go ahead and lift this up, and then go ahead and wedge your finger there so it doesn't kind of come back down. Then you could start over to this smaller side, and then you could lastly pull up on AMD. And then with that, the shroud comes off. Next, we want to try to get these small 4 screws that are on the AMD fan, mounting it, and we want to get those removed. By doing so, they are screwed into metal, so it may and probably will leave metal flakes as you unscrew it. So definitely don't do it over the motherboard or anywhere near it, to preventing the motherboard from possibly shorting out as you try to power it up. So let's get these 4 out. Now what you want to do is these 2 prongs right here, that's where the AMD logo goes over. So all we need to do, you could rotate it either which way, but all we need to do is turn it 90 degrees, and now we just screw it back in. Again, make sure that you try to reduce the amount of metal flakes that come out of this. So when you start the screw, make sure it's perfectly straight and turn it left like you're taking it out to make sure that it lines up properly with the holes. Then once you hear it pop into place, you could start tightening it, and it should not be too hard, AKA you're not cross-threading the metal, and that way that helps reduce the amount of metal flakes that you'll produce. Make it a little bit loose for now, so that way you could start another one, and that way you know that it's properly aligned, and then you could start tightening them down. Once you have the 4 tightened, you can try to be extra safe for the metal flakes and make sure that any metal that's in there, you could spray them out. Make sure that, again, any of those metal flakes will not go to the motherboard. So that's the only risk that you have doing this, but for the most part, it's relatively safe. Again, we have these tabs up top. We have the AMD logo. Go ahead and just set it on top and then just push, and everything should click right back into place. And there you go. Now you have the mounting holes for the CPU, and if you line it up properly, you can see the AMD logo is now on top. But first, I'm going to clean off this thermal paste, because as you see, I did a fingerprint in there. That's not perfect. And I will have to clean the CPU as well, because I don't know if you can see that, but there is a little bit of oil from my finger, obviously when I held it in place to set it in there. What I will do is, instead of getting a big bottle of alcohol, I just have this alcohol wipe. So at first, what I'm gonna do is just clean it off like normal with a standard paper towel, and I'll just touch everything up with alcohol to make sure all the oils are off. If it was a personal cheap rig that I was gonna build, I would probably just let these fingerprints be, and that would be fine. But because I'm building this for somebody, I want this to be as perfect as possible. So after I have the thermal paste cleared off, I'll just come back and touch it up with some alcohol. So that's pretty clean. And then I'll come back over here to the CPU and try to get that little fingerprint off. So now everything is perfectly clean. All right, let's get these screws out. For a thermal paste replacement, I'm gonna be using the Arctic MX5. All right, let's get this NVMe installed. Make sure to take out any other studs that are shorter than the ones that you need, so that way you don't short out and actually damage your NVMe. Now, what I will say is that this is very close to the shroud. There's really nothing that we can do about it unless we were to cut off this mount, but I think that's gonna be perfectly fine as is. Well, first off, I went ahead and took off the glass panel, and I actually put it back in the box with the foam, so that way the glass is not gonna be damaged at all while I'm messing with the computer build. Again, we got this case mainly because it had RGB, that you could actually change the colors and everything, versus some other cheaper RGBs where it's usually a static rainbow color and you can't really change anything about it. I'm gonna modify a couple things in here. Like the front here, there is a metal grill behind the fans. There is no need for that ever. So they actually make these so that you can pop them out. So I will be taking off the front panel, removing this grill. That way the RGB can actually show through a lot better as well. It does come with a little fan header. It is Molex powered, so keep that in mind depending on what power supply you're gonna have and what cables you need installed. Pretty much you have no control over these fans. They're just gonna be full on, which I believe these fans are 1500 RPM. So it's not gonna be too loud, hopefully. But it is nice because they do have the power and the LED all through the same cable here, and they plug in nicely to this hub. Something I did just find interesting is I looked at the accessories pack, and it has this little cube looking thing. And also it has brackets, replacement brackets, because these brackets, once you pop them out, you can no longer put them back in. But the interesting thing is this. I have not seen this before. interesting way of doing it. Let me show you what this is. So if you want to mount your GPU vertically, you would put this in, make this slot fit in here, let it kind of pop into place, turn it 90 degrees, and now this is your actual mount. So now all you need is just a PCI Express riser. So how this works is your GPU doesn't just sit on it, it actually locks into here. So what you would do is start this all the way to the right, get the tab, this back end of your GPU mount, and the goal is to lock it into this little plastic tab that's sticking out. And as you see, I can't like lift it up because it's kind of mounted. And then what you would do is once you have these PCI Express lanes open, you would slide this to the left to line it up, and then you could securely mount your GPU on the top here, and you could also add in a screw into one of these holes to mount the bracket down here too. So the interesting thing is if you were to do this, which I would not recommend, this is far too close to the glass panel and won't add enough cooling efficiency to this type of GPU. Only thing that's interesting, I don't know if this would actually work, because the PCI Express riser that you would need, it would only need to fit onto the metal pins and not actually lock into this latch. I don't know how many risers are like that, but that's specifically what you need. So you'd have to keep that in mind if you wanted to do this. Very interesting, but I don't know the practicality. All right, because this is a cheaper case, again, I need to get the metal grill cleaned up for better airflow. So I do need to remove just about all the fans, except for the back one. The buttons and USB ports and everything are actually integrated into the front panel. So to remove it, we need to get all these cables passed through. So underneath, you could go ahead and grab that. But the nice thing about this case is that it is pretty cheap and it does have a mesh front, so it should be relatively good for air cooling. I do see that there is kind of like a mesh fabric underneath in between the fan and the metal grill. That's probably over necessary. The metal grill itself will take on most of the dust and keep it out. So if you did want to remove all these fans and remove that mesh, it would probably actually increase the airflow in this case. But the main goal of taking this off is we want to get these fan grills out of here. There's no necessary reason for them and can actually hinder the airflow. So let's get these out of here. Just by bending these back and forth, they should eventually break free. The top two were easy, but because these are mounted in 4 spots, the easiest thing to do is kind of push one edge in and just kind of lift it up and down, and eventually that will break off that tab. Then we could go to the other side and do the same thing. I guess they do fit. I guess these holes up top and the inner ones. So yeah, so it looks like you can fit definitely the 120s or 140s, but there's a lot more coverage, well, a different variety of areas where you could actually put a 140 fan versus a 120. So if you wanted to, you could actually remove these fans and actually mount them to the case. So that way, if you ever need to take off the front panel, you don't have to disconnect your fans, but you would technically kind of have to disconnect these. But as you see, the length for these are a lot longer than the fans. And you can remove the front panel and possibly make it a little bit easier to clean over time as needed. But yeah, it's just kind of a weird thing. Again, these cheap cases have just weird quirks like that. But anyhow, this is open now. Should offer a lot more airflow going through it. And we'll get rid of these things. But what I've noticed too is it seems kind of messy. Because I don't have these cables attached at all. You could add zip ties or something like that, or even like a casing to cover this whole thing up. Again, this is for the fan. What I'm gonna do to make it look tidy is just twist it. So by twisting one end, it's gonna rotate it together. And now it looks like one cable when you move it around. So with it twisted, I'm gonna go ahead and plug that back into the controller. And that way it will keep its position. I was gonna double side tape it right in this location. This actually is sticking out further than the case. So if you put the panel on, it's gonna bow the panel and it's not gonna fit correctly. You can make it fit, but it's gonna be bent and just look kind of weird. So second idea is, because they are magnets, I'm gonna get the power supply installed, and maybe it will stick on to the power supply magnetically, and then I'll kind of shove it down here. So that way I know it's on the bottom and it shouldn't be able to pop out or anything like that. All right, for the power supply, what we're gonna do is make sure that we have the necessary cables needed attached, so that way they don't really have to get in here and add in cables. I will be including the extra cables that comes with this. Here they had an extra PCI Express cable and more SATA cables, but for this specific case, you could fit SATA drives on the front side in this area, or you could fit the larger drives in these trays. So to compensate for that, if, or most likely when, they upgrade to a solid state drive or SSD for more storage, I will have these SATA connectors tucked in here. That way they can install drives without adding too much. And again, for the fan control module, we need Molex cables, so I have that cable attached already in preparation for that. And what already comes included is PCI Express cables, 6+2, so two 8-pin connectors at maximum, already comes installed, as well as a 4+4 CPU connector, and the standard 24-pin motherboard connector. When installing it, I will be facing the fans down, because underneath we do have a filter that is removable to be cleaned. And what we want is that fan to be sucking in air and exhausting it. And that way it's not gonna pull in hot air from the case if there is any, which in this case there's really not. But it's better just to go ahead and use the case to its best features. So with all the cables installed, let's go ahead and slide this thing in. And what we're left with is lining up these holes to line up with the power supply unit, and we'll get that mounted in. The case came with a bag of accessory screws that is going to be needed. The power supply does come with zip ties and Velcro straps and 4 screws already that you can use for it. But because we have so much, what we can do is use these case screws, which are the same that are going to be in there. Basically, they look like they got a hex head on them with a star head, and underneath you're going to see that they have like little ridges around the bottom. So that way it can actually kind of grip into the metal to make sure it doesn't come loose. So with those, we just need 4 of them. Make sure you're finding the proper holes and not just sticking it into a hole, because there are holes all around here and the screw can go, but you just want to make sure you get the right ones that are actually threaded. Reason that there are other slots to put the screws is so, again, like I mentioned, if you did have a power supply that the fan was orientated the other way for some reason, then you can easily reverse the power supply and you have holes already ready to take these mounting screws. With that in, I went ahead and managed some of the cables where I think that they should go. Again, let's see if this works. Magnetic back here. Yeah, it sticks right into place. And then what we have is I already tucked the Molex cable back there as well. So we'll power this up. Molex is always a little bit harder to connect, hence everybody's with SATA now. But usually wiggling it around, it gets the connectors in just right. There we go. And then we'll just tuck the rest of it back in here behind the power supply. The SATA cables I went ahead and tucked in here as well. Lastly, I'll tuck in the PCI Express power cables. I got the 24-pin just tucked into the front here. The CPU power kind of passed through here. And yeah, let's get the motherboard installed now. When installing the motherboard, we need to check for the standoffs to actually attach the motherboard to the case. Most cases come pre-installed with standoffs in the ATX format, but our specific motherboard is going to be a micro ATX. So we will have to modify where these standoffs are located. There should be 6 mounting holes for this specific motherboard. To find out exactly where they need to go, some cases have them marked saying micro ATX, ATX, or something like that. This case does not. What we want to do is kind of set this in here and kind of see where the holes are needed. We see that There are standoffs here and here already, but I do not have one here or here. Reason being, because again, they made this for ATX, we need to move these two standoffs up. And the top ones do seem to be in line as well. Sometimes the accessory kit comes with a standoff remover. In this case, it does not. So I do have a little bit. This looks like a 5mm, I believe, bit. I should be able to get these in here and unscrewed. I do want to still check these other 4 to make sure that they're tight, because sometimes they may be loose. Before we start screwing, let's go back to the motherboard accessory box and let's get the back IO plate. The orientation of this, typically the audio outputs are always going to be at the bottom and the HDMI ports are going to be up top. Just in case, you can kind of see the plate on how it would fit on here. We could see all the holes are lining up. So if the motherboard were to align that way, we know that the IO shield needs to be installed that way. When doing so, you come from the inside. We're going to try to snap it into place. There are little metal things all around it, but as long as you push on these corners on the top and bottom, they should fit just nicely into spot. And right now, if I were to push on this, it is not coming loose. I'm not pushing too hard, but just tapping and it's not loose. So it is installed correctly. Now we can bring the motherboard back in here. And there are some tabs on the IO shield. And typically, some of these tabs go on top of these metal housings. Make sure you avoid any cables that are installed, like the fan cable is pre-installed. And now it just kind of fits perfectly into spot. Yep, everything looks perfect. So as you see, these little tabs are on top now of these housings. So now with it majorly into place, we need to get the right screws for these. The motherboard accessories do not actually include the screws. The screws are going to be with the case accessories. Typically, they're all in one bag and they're all mixed together, like we were showing earlier for the power supply. To find out exactly which screw is which, it's easiest to go to the case guide, and inside they have the accessories box list. So what you want to find is the motherboard screw. So right here is the motherboard or the HD SSD, which is screw B. Doesn't really help you, but when you look at the image, you can see that it's kind of rounded, but it has like a washer looking style shape to it. And we're gonna need 6 of them. It's a lot easier to have a longer magnetic tip screwdriver. If you don't, it's just a little bit more troublesome, but this does make it a lot easier. So again, making sure that everything lines up here, like it should where we left it. You kind of apply some force because again, the IO plate is gonna have some resistance. When you add some force, make sure that the holes are lined up. You go ahead and turn back left a little bit so it snaps into place and start screwing it down. Now you don't want to tighten it all the way down yet because as you see, there's still some play. So let's get more of the screws in before we start tightening it. This is where the long screw comes in handy for the top 2 because they are way up there and sometimes be hard to get. If you have any fans pre-installed, it'd probably be easier to take off the top fans first and then try to install the motherboard, because these screws tend to be the worst. All right, so now all the screws are started. What I'll do is apply a little bit more force towards the back IO plate just to make sure that everything is kind of lined up back there. And I'll start tightening them down. And don't make them too tight, just make them tight enough that you can do with 2 fingers. There's no need to crank them down because motherboards have layers of metal in between them that power all the different circuits. And if you tighten it too much, it could crush them and start jumping the power, and that could be very, very bad. We've got our 6 tightened now. This motherboard's not going anywhere. And in turn, without even looking, I'll let you guys look first, the IO should be perfectly in line. Now it's just a matter of actually plugging all these cables in. So before I go too far, and before I forget this is the switch for the front button to turn on and off the LEDs and swap through everything. Usually this doesn't matter which way you put it in, whether it is this way or the other way. It's just a switch, momentary switch. So you're not gonna short anything out depending on which way you plug that in. So that will be put back in there. With the motherboard installed, we kind of understand where we need to route these into what holes. So let's go look around front again. So we know USB 3.0 is going to be a big connector. That's going to be right down here. We'll feed that through right there. We have USB 2.0, which they're going to be labeled on here. So we'll just go right over here directly next to the 3.0. So we'll route that through the same hole. We have our audio, which is going to be over here, this very back corner. So we'll route this through this hole. All of our little pins for the front panel are going to go right in the front here. So we'll put these into the first slot as well. All right, and we still have our 24 pin connector and our CPU power connector coming through, which is perfect. And I think that is all the cables that we need. So let's get these plugged in now. For these, they're a pain. Go ahead and check your motherboard manual. Usually towards the front of the quick start guide, they'll show you exactly what the connectors are and the orientation. The orientation of this is actually going to be towards the top of the motherboard. From your angle, we're going to be looking at the connector layout according to this exact thing. And we know it's this connector because this says JFP1, and just below this connector down here printed on the motherboard, on the bottom is JFP1. Now for these cables, we see what they're labeled and we find the corresponding spots on where to connect them. One thing to take note is the LEDs do have a plus and minus. So make sure that it corresponds as well to the positive and negative to the actual connectors as well. As you see, the SWs or the switches do not have a plus or minus because again, they're momentary switches. And again, it's just turning it on and off, and there's no necessary reason to have it dedicated to positive or negative. With all of those connected now, let's go ahead and turn this back up. Let's feed back all the extra cable that we don't need inside of the case. Perfect. That's looking pretty clean. And just make sure that definitely the USB 3 cable, that it's not binding too much because you don't want to add a lot of strain to the motherboard. So just make sure that this is pretty loose. Then around back, we can make the magic happen. The case comes with zip ties, and there's a whole bunch of zip tie mounting sections that you can use all the way around this case, all over here and on the sides. So let's utilize them. So I'm going to start with the front top for cable managing, as I need extra cable up top here because again, the front panel is connected by these cables. So I'm going to push a little extra cabling through here before I start tying anything down. Go ahead and get this through the hole first on the metal, and we'll get this tied down. Perfect. Also, you don't want to crank them down too much because you don't want to actually crush the cables. So all I'm doing is just kind of doing a modest tight to it. And as I work my way down, I'm going to group cables together that make sense to be in that run. What I'm also going to do is keep the case fans separately, because if you need to modify these, you don't want to ruin this whole grouping of cables. So we're going to actually tie these a little bit lower. Also, reason being is these are also attached to the front of the case. So keeping these separate and a little bit loose will allow the front panel a little bit more room to be removed. Also, during cable management, you may find some things just don't make sense. So these need to be closer up, but this cable's in the way. So what I did is disconnect the CPU power, run this cable back through this way. I'll bring it back in front of the switch for the LEDs. And now there's a lot less binding going on. So I'll run these back up and connect them back to the motherboard. And also same thing for leaving these a little bit loose. That way, when you apply the side panel back on, it's not going to be bulging out, and that some of these cables actually have room to maneuver around. And for that reason, I'll leave these cables right here that bend early alone, but I'll get this 24 pin power connector tied down one last time and tuck this little bottom bit in. Coming back over on this side, same thing, we'll start up towards the top. And a little tip, if you can't get the zip tie through these holes, what you can do is take the end and kind of fold it over a little bit, and then that will kind of help you get it started so that way it doesn't go through towards the front. And what do you know? We used all the zip ties. In case you needed any more for any reason, double check your power supply, because usually that accessories kit does come with more zip ties. You could get some scissors, or I have these little cutters right here that will work perfect. So one thing to note is because of the zip ties, they have a little square end that actually hold it in place. When you go ahead and cut them, make sure that the square ends are facing inwards to make sure that it's not going to interfere with the case side panel. Just before we get it started, I just noted that after messing with everything, the front panel I/O buttons and LEDs were a little bit loose. And just to combat that, again, because I know this will be moved and shipped around, I'm going to zip tie this up around the USB 3.0. Just add a little bit extra there so that way I know it's being pushed on slightly, and zip tie that down a little bit. And that way now I know that these will definitely not be coming out anytime soon, especially during shipping. And same thing as before, cut off the end, and I will rotate it around back so that way you don't see that nasty little square and everything looks very smooth. One last thing, almost forgot, because again, they probably will be upgrading to a hard disk drive or solid state drive again, because again, that NVMe that I have in there is only 500 gigs. Again, trying to get it into that budget. So what I'm gonna do is install a SATA cable, just one of them for now. So let's go ahead and feed in the 90-degree angle into the back. So that way the cable can go directly into here. I'll plug it in the bottom one. It clicks into place perfectly. And around back, I'm just gonna tuck that into that drive bay. So that way it's there whenever they need to actually add in a hard drive or something. And with all that, let's power it on. All right, let's flick the switch and power it on. Oh, there we go, okay. Take a quick second. All right, perfect. Took a couple of seconds, but after that, we did get to see everything in here. Quickly looking at this, it does say that it does have a Ryzen 5 5600G with the graphics. We have dual channel memory, 16 gigs, so it's reading all of it rather than just 8 gigs. It's running at 2400 megahertz, so we will have to go adjust that. And I got my keyboard plugged in, and obviously we have no SATA cables or anything attached, so there should be nothing there. And looks like all we need to do is press F1 to set it up. Now that we're in the BIOS, we want to make sure that our memory is running at the correct speeds. I tried clicking this and exiting and resaving it for MSI, but it's saying it's not making any changes. So to correct that, which again, I don't know why, we need to go to Advanced, Overclock Settings, then over here at XMP, we want to enable Profile 1. And what we can do is go ahead and then exit, as now we see that it's going to be set, click yes, and let's make sure that it gets booted up running the RAM at 3600 megahertz. And as we see now, the speed of the RAM is 3600 megahertz. The next thing is to get Windows 10 installed on this thing. I asked him if he wanted Windows 10 or 11. He said 10. I'm like, that's fine because I know there's still some issues with 11. And that's pretty much it. And let's just see real quick about these LEDs. Yeah, well that works perfect. So we got red, green, blue, purple, teal, yellow, white, and glowing red. Glowing colors and flashing colors, off, and rainbow. So that's what the LEDs look like, very easy. One thing I did want to mention is that these buttons up top, they actually are pretty nice. They do need some travel to actually enable the button. So that way, if you're up here and you like push on this, it's not resetting the system. So that way you can make sure that you're clicking the right one and you actually click it properly. And to wrap things up, I want to say thank you because you made it all the way to the end of the video. And I only ask one little favor, if you could just like this video before YouTube takes that away. Also, if you want to know how to actually set up Windows and what to do after all this, let me know down in the comments so that way I can make a video based on that if you want it. So until then, see you next time.